This is the Andrew Lake Podcast, and in this episode, we're talking about categories of human knowledge. I'd like to welcome you to the Andrew Lake Podcast. My name is Andrew and I am your host. And today I'll be giving an overview of some of the pillars of human knowledge that we're going to use to construct the conversations that we're going to have. There's a few broad categories. Some of them might be familiar to you, some of them may not. But we're going to be explaining them as we go along, so hopefully they can pique your interest. The grand arrow, the true north, the one thing we always want to be moving towards, is improving the quality of your existence. Everything that we talk about here will be pointing in that direction. They will all have an arrow to them. They'll all have a movement to them. And if we keep that in the back of our minds, we can remember that the whole point of every conversation we have hereafter is to improve the quality of your life and in the grand scheme of things, the quality of your existence. I see these conversations as a stepping stone towards something better, something more complex. I've had many stepping stones in my life, and these are the people that have influenced me. On one level, these will be explanations of things that I find interesting, of concepts I've found useful, and they'll be an introduction to things that you might want to learn more about. I'll also be pointing you in the direction of further research and study that you can do in your own time, and I'll be doing introductions to the people that have influenced me as we go along. As for the grand pillars or categories of human knowledge, there's a few broad areas that I'd like to lay out so that we can have an overview of where we're headed. I think the first step that we can take is with therapy, self-help, and personal development. So these are basic ideas and concepts that you can use to get your life in order. This is not complicated or grandiose. It's very basic things like your diet and your habit, your relationships, and your motivation, and how you build your daily routine. I also categorize business and investing in this section. Saving money is important, learning financial intelligence is important, and that will be a component of the things that we learn about as we move forward. At times, I will be giving overt calls to action. So these will be prescriptions or things that you can do, activities that you can undertake in order to test out whether they improve your life or not. Of course, we'll be discussing the dynamics of how to improve and how to use these techniques correctly, because with any tool, it can be used the wrong way. So we'll be discussing it to hopefully put it in a way that is useful for you, and you can make up your own mind whether you want to continue doing it or change it as you see fit. Once we get deep into personal development, it doesn't take long to realize that psychology as a theoretical framework is very important. Psychology, as I understand it, is the story in your head. It's the words, sentences, paragraphs, essays, and novels that you've got bouncing around inside your thoughts. It's also the relationship between your thoughts and the behaviors that you have, the feelings that you have. Emotional mastery will also be a big component of the discussions that we have. For some people, emotional mastery is a foreign idea, and just the thought of being able to master your emotions might be new, but it's a well-studied field of psychology, and I'll be describing it from my own personal point of view. The world of psychology has a rich and vast array of maps that we can use to understand our mind. For example, a research psychologist can sit in a chair with his group of therapy patients, listen to them talk, and analyze their conversations. From this analyzing that he does, he can then come up with scripts or maps like a blueprint that we can use to put onto our lives and in our own conversations. This is exactly what Eric Berne did with his transactional analysis. As another example, a psychologist might ask people, what's important in life? What is good in life? What is your ideal life? And he can write down the answers. And he might do this over thousands of people and lay out all the answers and see clear categories of different kinds of psychology that different people have. This is exactly what Clare Graves did with his theory of psychology called spiral dynamics. And that will be just one of the things we discuss moving forward. Beyond psychology, we get deeper into philosophy. What is the point of life? Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? These deeper questions go beyond just analysis and dig deeper into our grand intuition of what it means to exist. The French philosopher Albert Camus said, famously perhaps, that the only philosophical problem is whether or not to commit suicide. Now, that might be a bit of a harsh way or a crude way of getting to the question, what does it mean to be alive? But he's got a point. And of course, we're going to be addressing these questions as we move forward. Another name drop I'd like to put in the philosophy section is that of the Socratic method. So Socrates, old mate, your buddy, would walk around the markets having conversations with people, and he'd ask them questions to clarify what exactly they meant by certain things. Things like the good life. What is virtue? What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean to do the right thing? And of course, he'd keep asking questions as a way of discovering more and more what meaning actually is. And this is another one of the philosophical devices that we'll be exploring the dynamics of moving forward. Building on philosophy, we can talk about religion. Now, of course, we've gone beyond the idea of a man in the cloud with a beard telling us what to do. We want to go beyond atheism as well. I like the idea that Alain de Botton puts out in one of his talks, or the phrase that he uses for religion, which is the buffet religion. So we want to pick and choose the best bits from the world religions. Of course, we've got our main ones, our classics, which is Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism. But there's also another definition of religion, which is the religion that we create for ourselves. And that's what we want to do by picking and choosing the best bits from all the world religions. Religion has a rich mythology to it, as explored and discussed by people like Joseph Campbell and Alan Watts. And these people are really beyond dogmatic religion, and they're also beyond militant atheism. And that's the sort of theoretical framework that we want to grow into. perhaps one of the most fundamental background concepts that we have for all endeavors of thought would be science. Science as a blueprint, as I like to think about it, is about maths, analysis, data, and the collection of information. Science comes up with equations, it makes predictions, it creates the maps in a certain way, and it explains things in a certain way. The scientific method starts with a hypothesis, then goes into observation, and has controlled experiment, sets up its limits of its observations and its experiment, and then collects and packages data. Now, we can do this for the hard scientists. We can do this for the hard sciences, which would be empirical science, but we can also use the scientific method for the more ethereal things, such as mysticism and soul. I'll talk about soul in a minute when we come to music. Our experience of life is nested in physics, which is then nested in biology, which is then nested in the words and the harder to point at things, which are beyond the atoms and protons and electrons bouncing around. Another one of the major categories of human knowledge that I'd like to talk about is what we call spirituality and transformative practice. So this is different to religion, and it's more about the hard experience of life, not so much about the theoretical and the philosophical talking about life. Aldous Huxley wrote this book, quite famous, called The Doors of Perception. And he talked about how his perception started to expand. And I think he was starting to get onto something, but I don't know if he quite took it far enough. Abraham Maslow also had a book called Towards a Psychology of Being. In this he speaks about peak experiences and moving beyond the psychology of words inside your head. I also think he was starting something but didn't quite go as far as we can. To go beyond that sort of psychology, we need to look at mysticism. These will be the people such as Sadhguru, who are from an Eastern background and have a very different way of understanding reality to the Western way of thinking. What we're looking for is a marriage of both, and we want the best from both worlds. The cultural and creative component of this conversation will be music. I'd like to present music to you. I'd like to talk about music appreciation. I think music is great as a metaphor, as a method, and as a way of expanding your field of awareness and understanding in many different ways. Music is an expression of soul, and if you don't believe you have a soul, and if you don't believe soul exists, you've obviously never heard of James Brown or any of his music, so I suggest you do some homework there. I'd also like to focus on musicians that are aware of these higher states of consciousness. Musicians such as Keith Jarrett, who marriages the line between developing a skill and developing awareness in a grand sense. So we've got personal development, psychology, philosophy, religion, science, and spirituality, as well as music as a cultural expression. And the thing that brings all these together and makes them interact, the lubrication of the machine, if it were, or the blood of the organism, if you will, is what we call integral theory. Integral theory is a meta-theory, which means it's a theory about theories. It's a real thing. You can find out about it. You can study it. It's pioneered by an author called Ken Wilber, and you can buy his books, you can read them. But if it all sounds too heavy, then keep listening here to get a bit more of an introduction and a bit more of an understanding. The basic premise of integral theory is that everyone is right, but only half right. Everyone has a part of the truth, but it's only partial. Everything can be discussed from many angles in a comparative and contrasting sort of way. Integral theory is what allows for accelerated learning, paradoxical thinking, extreme open-mindedness, and the blurring of lines between different disciplines. As an analogy, I'd like to do a description of how I think knowledge or information might be passed on from one person to another. Let's imagine I'm trying to describe to you the nuts and the bolts of a set of scaffolding. I can't tell you that we're building scaffolding until I can describe to you enough nuts and bolts. I'm also going to have to describe to you the pieces of scaffolding. And it's going to take some time, and I'm going to have to go into detail on each piece before you start to have enough pieces to put it together and see that it's scaffolding. Now, at some point in this process, what's going to happen is you're going to realize that we're building scaffolding, and then you'll be on board, and you'll be learning more and more about pieces of scaffolding and nuts and bolts, and you'll get more and more of the picture. But then, of course, I'll have the problem of describing the building to you. It's like I have to ask you to pick up a brick, go over there, put it down, and then do it again. Of course, you might do it once, but if I ask you to do it repeatedly, you might say, "Why are you doing this? What is the meaning behind this?" Unfortunately, with grand ideas, I can't just tell you we're building a building. I can't just tell you I'm teaching you integral theory. You need to have a certain amount of pieces before you start to see what it is we're building. Of course, just like the scaffolding, at a certain point in the building, you'll see that we're building a building, and then you'll be down to getting on track and learning about the pieces and seeing how they fit together. Beyond that, the scaffolding breaks away, and you go beyond all that you've learnt. Another big component of these conversations will be the people that I bring to the discussion. I have a few ideas about who I'd like to interview. At this stage, it will be whoever says yes. It's early days. But don't worry, you won't have to be sick of hearing the sound of my voice. So we will be bringing other people into the conversation. And lastly, what I'd like to add is that these conversations will be my personal testimony. These will be stories from my life. These will be the intimate and significant events that have happened to me. I've had many extraordinary events happen in my life, many of which I'm still trying to make sense of, many of which I can't explain, I don't understand. It's going to be a process to learn and disseminate these experiences into words that can be accessible to an audience, so I'd be thankful for your patience. Something is happening to me. Very few people in my life are aware of it. Partly this is because I don't let on, and I think that's fair enough because I don't know what the appropriate response is to these sort of events. So these stories will be more like poetry rather than academic explanations. Some speakers put their personal testimony at the forefront of their ideas, and I can understand that approach because how you understand something and the significance of theories, concepts, and processes is nested in your story. At the moment, it feels like I've been shot in a rocket and I've landed on the moon of enlightenment. I've crawled out of that rocket, looked around coughing and spluttering, rubbing my eyes, trying to make sense of what's going on. But we can only move forward in a linear fashion. And this makes it incredibly hard to describe a multidimensional and infinite experience. So, I think that's enough for now. If these sort of things seem foreign to you, these sort of concepts seem far off, well, keep listening because I'll be explaining them more in detail as we go along. And if some of these concepts are familiar to you, well, then that's a good thing because then we can start to blend them together and get them working as a part of the bigger picture. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. My name is Andrew, and we'll be back soon with more.